Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice and shine some light on some titles that you can bring into your libraries, classrooms and hopefully onto your bookshelves at home too. This week's episode of Comic Boom is sponsored by ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. And on today's episode, I am delighted to be joined by James Turner, cartoonist and writer from the Phoenix comic. You will know James's work, which has been collected into graphic novels by David Fickling, the publisher. Titles such as Starcat, which are just brilliantly funny and currently nominated for an Excelsior Award. James talks to me today about his series Clatters and Bump, but also about a new graphic novel coming out. So people who aren't familiar with I Hate Pixies from the Phoenix comic, that story that's brilliantly funny is coming out as a graphic novel that can be slotted into your libraries, into your classrooms, renamed as Toby and the Pixies, but the same characters, the same excellent storylines and situations that Toby and the Pixies get into. So definitely watch out for that one. Perfect for readers aged 7 and above. So we talk about that project a little bit today, as well as a little tangent at the end about advent calendars. So always seasonal, always topical on Comic Boom, advent calendars in May, especially for you. I really enjoyed talking to James. He's very humble, he's a very nice, down-to-earth guy, very dry wit, and I just really enjoyed talking to him about his process for writing and drawing and how those things differ and come together so brilliantly on the page. Thanks to David Fickling for partnering on this episode and bringing James into the fold so that I could talk to him. Here's what James had to say. Hello, James. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. As always, I like to start the podcast by asking guests to tell us a little bit about being a fan of comics, a reader of comics. Where did that all start for you?
I mean, I think I was sort of always making comics ever since I was like drawing, which is from a tiny age. I would combine images to tell a story even before I could write. And then, once I could add letters to them, that was a full-fledged comic, although it's a comic even without text. So yeah, I've always been making comics.
And what about reading? Has it always been part of your reading diet as well? Did those two things go side by side? Were there a lot of comics about when you were younger?
I was very lucky because my local library growing up had a huge collection of Asterix and Tintin books. So like every week I was going home with a different volume of that. And, it was very much a main part of my diet at that time. So, yeah, it was great to have those around. And then my local bookshop as well had shelves and shelves of books. So Calvin and Hobbes was a big part of my growing up as well.
Also, massive Calvin and Hobbes fan. So that is great to hear. And it's lovely to hear people giving a shout out to their library. There's such a brilliant resource and sadly at risk at the moment. But they're such an important part of so many people that come on and talk about the access they've had to different comics.
Yeah, I never would have been able to read so many books, so many Tintin and Asterix. That would have been prohibitively expensive at that age. So
yeah, exactly. So we've heard about the starting point. How did your reading habits changed? What are you reading now? What kind of things are you into?
The terrible thing is, since the pandemic, my reading has absolutely gone through the floor. I've got 5 books lying by my bed that I'm halfway through and just struggling to make any progress in them. They're mostly science fiction books, I think, is probably my go-to genre. But I'm ashamed to admit that I barely read anymore. It's terrible.
Why do you think that is?
I think I just got, in the pandemic, I just got, quite anxious, I think a lot of people did. And I think my attention span just dropped. So this is embarrassing to say. I watch TV a lot in bed now. I'm glued to my phone, and it's it's not a positive direction for my life to take.
But I do think, I know this is something that guests have disagreed with me on in the past, but I do think that the way that the image and text works together, it feels less effortful for me to read a comic. I think there's something around the image and the words together, which means because it's accessible, it doesn't mean it's simple, it doesn't mean it's easy, but it's less of a mental drain for me to read a comic than it is to sit and plough through pages of prose.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. It's a different experience. Well, you're still reading and you're still, getting a full story. Yeah. It's a totally different experience. I mean, I think part of why I got into comics was because I loved animation as well. So I love cartoons, and making a comic is sort of a very cheap way of making a cartoon in a way. It's like you're getting all the wacky, imagery and whatever, and you're getting the story. It's just you don't have to draw every image 100 times.
Yeah, much easier. I did film at university and lived with animators, very pasty and pale. Didn't leave their rooms very much, just drawing endless pictures. Yeah, I don't think it's good for you.
I took the easy way out.
So obviously you're writing for children now. Do you think that your reading diet as a child and your experiences of being a comics reader informs your writing and your projects that you work on now?
I mean, I think perhaps it's hard to say, but in like looking back, it could just be that having access to so many comics sort of legitimized it to me as an art form, like especially because it's like the European comics, where in Europe it's a much sort of more established thing that comics are considered an all ages thing.
Yeah, well respected.
So perhaps to have it as just like an everyday part of what I was reading meant that I didn't even think about it as not being something worth producing. That I've always thought comics is something good to make. I suppose you could say that was the influence that reading comics early had on me.
Yeah, I think it's so important.
Plus, I think having read Calvin and Hobbes at a young age, I think probably I always worry that anyone reading my comics will think this is just Calvin and Hobbes. So I think there's a very marked influence on me from that.
So can you tell us a little bit about your journey to making comics a career? How did that happen for you?
It was quite winding. I finished university. I was working as a programmer, and I felt like I wasn't, because I used to love drawing. Obviously, I've always loved drawing, but I'd sort of stopped drawing. So I began making comics again as a way to relearn drawing. And I was part of like an online community. So I was posting the comics there. These were called Beaver and Steve, about a beaver and his lizard friend Steve. They, the community was in sort of supported me in it. And I started posting them to other websites. And then I was reading other comics. I read Casey Green, who is like a famous American cartoonist who did the This Is Fine dog that's now sort of taking over the internet. He was just starting out then as well. And seeing his stuff really encouraged me to sort of push my stuff out there more. And, my comics sort of became more and more confident. Then I ran into John Aggs, who was a manga cartoonist at the time, and he sort of put me in touch with the DFC, which was the sort of the precursor comic to the Phoenix. And so I started working for them and doing the Super Animal Adventure Squad comic. And then when DFC finished and eventually the Phoenix started, they picked me up again, and that's how Starcat and I Hate Pixies came about.
And you've got quite a few different series and different ways of working, I imagine. Sometimes you're collaborating with other artists. Mm-hmm. You've got smaller strips like Clatters and Bumps. Can you tell us about your ways of working in those different forms and how they differ in your different ways of working when you do something that's solely just you on your own versus when you work with someone else? So
when I'm making a comic for myself to draw, I'm often writing it almost as a comic, especially if it's something short like Clatters and Bump. I'm drawing little thumbnail sketches as I'm writing it.
It kind of comes fully formed.
Exactly. And there's an element of it just sort of being slightly boring to just write, because part of a comic is the visuals, part of it is the expression that a character is pulling that sells the line. So that's how I work when I'm writing for myself. And I do that to some extent when I'm writing for somebody else. but I find that I'm more often going straight to script, which is not something I ever used to do. I don't know why I make that difference. I do still sometimes, do little thumbnail sketches, but it's different because I don't draw the end thing. They don't look like the characters that are going to be in it. So it's perhaps somehow it doesn't feel as relevant. But then once I've got the script finished that's for an artist, then, that gets sent away. The sort of rough pencils for it come back, and then I'll spend time going through that and feeding back and saying, basically, I wouldn't have drawn it this way. Why is he frowning? He should be smiling. And, all the things that I thought were obvious from the script, which were actually not obvious at all. So fixing all those things that I hadn't thought of to do, I have to get out of my head more when I'm doing a script for somebody else, because I just hadn't occurred to me that someone could ever think of it in a different way.
But likewise, do you find, though, that things come back sometimes and it's moved on from your expectations? Things have moved in a direction that you weren't necessarily expecting, but it's added something, and it's something that you're surprised in a good way. Yeah,
I'm always delighted when there's things that come back and I'm like laughing out loud when I see it, like a unicorn all squashed up or something that I didn't plan, I didn't visualize when I was doing the script, and I'm like, oh, I wish I'd thought of that. I would never have drawn it that well if I was doing it. So there's a delight to be had, and when you get something back that you didn't expect. And I think the other thing is that when I'm drawing a script, I'm the one putting funny little details in the background, but I would never write that into a script. So it's, that's very much in the hands of the artist, and it's always fun to see one of those. When you're writing for yourself to draw, do you have things that you would avoid because you find them difficult to draw? That's the other thing, that I feel much less inhibited when I'm writing a script for somebody else. Large crowd scenes. I'd never put in a script for myself. The whole glory of the universe unfolds before them in 1,000 million ways, and leave that for the artist to interpret. I love it. Looking across all of your work, humour seems really important. Is that something that is really important to you? Yeah, I think I find it very hard to take myself seriously, so I think it would be difficult to write a comic that didn't have a lot of humour in it. It's always for me the sort of the most important thing. I'm trying to write more and more story as we go. I'm trying to learn that skill. But I think humour is very much key to the human experience, if you want to go too fanciful. I think sci-fi in general as well, though, is all about what it means to be human. That's really what, for me, all sci-fi is all about. What are we? Yeah, good sci-fi shouldn't just be lasers and spaceships. It should hold up a mirror to society. Yeah, exactly. Which I'm sure my Starcat comic's about. Well, I was just about to say that's a perfect segue to Starcat. I was going to ask you to. We will talk about Toby and the Pixies, which is very exciting. But we always have Paul Register, who runs the Excelsior Awards, on to talk through the kind of short lists. And so we discussed Starcat Turnip in Time because it's one of the shortlisted books for the Excelsior Award. I'd just like to hear from you about the book and about Starcat in general. I think it's a really good opportunity for teachers and librarians listening to maybe build their knowledge of the kind of books that they can be putting into their reading spaces. So yeah, can you give us a bit of a rundown about what it's about and what kind of readers might enjoy it? Well, Starcat is essentially a story about a cat, It's also a spaceship. Getting it wrong from the start, right? yeah, it's about a star that's also a spaceship. No. Anyway, it's about a cat that is also a spaceship, and inside is a crew that fly it around space doing missions for the Space Mare. My sort of idea for it was, it's sort of like Star Trek, but what if everyone on the crew of Star Trek was a coward or an idiot or selfish, which is the total opposite of Star Trek. So I sort of came from that premise, and we have, the captain who's on the front face of it is heroic, but really just is desperate for attention and wants people to think he's a hero. You've got the robot one, who is, pretends that he's the most sophisticated advanced machine ever, much better than humans, but he's lazy and selfish and greedy. And you've got your science officer, Plix, who's a sort of jelly. And she's, obviously, as a science officer, she should be the clever one who knows everything, but she's just, hitting an atom with a hammer and hoping for the best. And finally, the pilot, who is sort of the only one who can actually control the Starcat. But unfortunately, she speaks a language that no one else on the crew can understand. And she's very much an agent of chaos. But when all is lost, the pilot usually has a plan to fix everything. And that somehow is a crew of 4 that flies the Starcat around.
It's brilliant. So Starcat appears in the Phoenix. Mm-hmm. And then I know, for example, we've had Neil Cameron on the show before, and the Mega Robo books are it's serialized in the Phoenix first and then becomes the book. Is it the same kind of premise?
Well, most of the comics have appeared in the Phoenix, but they were not sort of told as one continuous story. So then there's additional sections that have been added in to sort of join those bits up. So with book 1, it was actually never planned as a story. It was just a load of separate stories that we found a sort of through thread to connect together to make one continuous story. With this one, it's a bit of both. It planned it as a story, but we had already written comics that we just wanted to include. So they had that theme of science, which then made the book about Plix and her sort of science journey, if you will.
That's really interesting. And one of the things about having them in the book, it does obviously open it up to much wider audience, which I guess is going to be the case as well now that I Hate Pixies is being transformed. Is this again the same thing? So it's the serialized but put into a longer form story? Because I see then there's a name change as well.
Yes.
Why has it changed the name? I think that might upset people.
I prefer I Hate Pixies, but I think I can see that some people pointed out it might be a bit negative sounding. So if a parent is out there buying a book, they might not want something that sounds so horrible that they'll pick up on a whim. But yes, I prefer I Hate Pixies, but I understand the change.
It's a marketing move. Okay. I love I Hate Pixies. Can you tell us, for people who might not have had a chance to read it, a little bit about the story?
So yeah, I Hate Pixies is about a young boy called Toby who accidentally squashes the wicked king of the Pixies with a garden gnome. And by Pixie law, that makes him the king of the Pixies. But the crucial thing is Toby doesn't want to be king of the Pixies. He wants nothing to do with the Pixies, but the Pixies will not take no for an answer, and they insist on inserting themselves into his life, trying to help him with various things to, disastrous consequences.
I think that it's just a really great mix of kind of craziness, fancifulness, but also like the just everyday life of a child as well, like school and your normal life as well, kind of all mixed in, which makes it just really relatable and also really funny. I love it. How was it, the process of bringing the book together? Has that been completely painless, easy process, or has there been challenges along the way?
Yes, that's been much more simple than Starcat, because we very much, planned this as a book from the beginning. I think there were elements, we've sort of changed it as we've gone. So there's been things where we've had sort of, manipulated a bit to make it work as a story for the book. But mostly it's been fairly painless. And I even had to invent a whole system of how, because the pages in the book are half the size of a page in the Phoenix. So you can't just shrink them down or they'd be tiny. So I came up with a whole complex system of how you can break a page of 12 panels into 2 pages of 6 panels. And now a lot of the comics in the Phoenix you'll see use the same sort of roughly the same format of a page layout, just so it can be broken up into a book more easily later.
That's really clever.
Yes, it's quite a boring detail, but I was secretly very proud of it.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that I'd like think about for like a second and then be like, no, I can't be bothered. Oh no, my brain can't cope with this. That sounds great. I know you're doing some activities with the Phoenix as well. Do you do a lot of kind of workshops with children, young people? Is that something that's new? What can you tell us about that?
This is more or less my first ever workshop. I've done little bits and pieces, but I'm quite nervous about these sort of things. For some reason, I find it quite nerve-wracking to be in front of an audience of children. It's something I'm going to have to get better at.
It's terrifying. You're right. No, rightly terrified.
Yeah. Luckily, this is a digital one, so I won't be able to see if the children are losing interest or, wandering off and playing on their video games. But so I'm going to be teaching how to make a funny comic, in theory. I'm going to be coming up with new characters and drawing 4 panels of hopefully hilarious jokes. The idea is that kids will be able to follow along and make up their own comic at the end.
And how long is it? Is it an hour-long session?
I think it's an hour-long session.
Is that something that you'd like to do more of, do you think? I know it's maybe outside of your comfort zone, but do you think, would you like to do more school visits?
I think it's definitely a skill that a children's author needs. So it's something I think it would be a very good idea for me to get good at. And I think in theory, I should be good at it.
I think you'll find out that you are good at it. You just haven't tried yet. You haven't done it. You haven't got the evidence under your belt, but I'm sure you are good at it.
Hopefully.
Were you able to bring your love of drawing and comics into your school time? Was that nurtured, or was it very much something that was outside of school? We get quite mixed answers to these kind of questions, but I think it's always really interesting to build up a picture of the way in which education has influenced people, and maybe some reflections on how that could have been strengthened, maybe just in terms of thinking of takeouts that teachers could ponder on.
Yeah, I think, as I've said, I've always loved doing comics. And I think that wasn't really something I could do at school. I remember I did, for example, do very badly in my GCSE art because I wasn't really interested in the sort of the artworks that were, we were required to do. I think probably at primary school, it wasn't a big problem because I think comics perhaps is more accepted for you to do at that age. But once I got to secondary school, there didn't seem to be an outlet at school. I think the other kids perhaps were growing out of it. The only comics they wanted were sort of Marvel comics and that sort of thing, whereas I was still, drawing stuff like that was more like the Beano or whatever. That's
cartoony kind of, yeah,
it was funny, silly comics, not serious superhero comics. Although I did dabble in drawing my own superhero comics, which were, I think, terrible in retrospect. But it was very much I was just doing comics on my own in the background. And it sort of faded away and drew less and less until, as I said, it was sort of after university that I thought, I've got to relearn how to draw and rediscovered that love. Yeah,
I was very arty at school and went to art college and I studied film, but it was very much like an artsy type course. And then I just didn't draw for ages. And it's quite liberating when you reignite that and think, oh, yeah, this is something that's actually just in me. You're a bit rusty when you start back again, for sure. But it doesn't, but you can quite quickly build your skills back up, can't you?
Yeah, it's all about just doing it every day. I mean, the thing is that when I went to uni, I wasn't doing an art subject at all. I studied maths at university because I think it's two very different subjects. Like with maths, I knew I was good at it because if you get the right answer, you've done it right. Whereas the thing I think I struggle with art is the subjectivity of it, of course. It's like if you're not getting the approval, and it sounds like very attention seeking, but you don't know whether it's good or not. And that was
you do need that reassurance.
Exactly. It was sort of why I went into the math side of things, was because I needed, I wanted to know that I was doing something right, I suppose. And it was only sort of after university when I started to get my own personal confidence up that I think I got that confidence to go back into those more subjective forms.
And do you think, you mentioned having like an online community when you first started as well, and was the support from that community a key part of it as well, do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. If it wasn't for that, it was sort of a blogging site, sort of pre-Facebook and all that, that was just a few random people writing their thoughts on the internet. It was only because of that, because that really boosted my confidence, was meeting all these people that I never would have met normally, and it transformed my life probably. So it's that definitely let me make comics again.
I did a course last year, a graphic narrative course at Royal Drawing School, and about half the people that were on the course, we've kind of stayed in touch and are making a zine with each one with one of our comics in. And I had to proofread it last night, and I hadn't seen my one that I'd put in it for my comic for ages. And I just like, well, guys, I've proofread it, but the bad news is mine is terrible. I can't believe, when you look back at something, you're like, what is this? But they all reassured me that, oh no, it's fine. And I know that they would say that even if it was terrible, but it is, you do need those moments where people are just like, you know what, it's fine. And even, it is the best you can do at that moment, isn't it? And then you've got to kind of move on and not. How easy do you find it to kind of draw a line under your work and say, this is finished?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I struggle to look at my own work, especially shortly afterwards. It's always excruciating. I think I'm incredibly lucky that, I've got an editor who says this is done. You've sent it in. I accept this as a work of writing, and that's I've got that one single person that can give me validation, and that's enough for me to be able to send it off. But I do find, while I can't look at something immediately afterwards and be like, okay, that's good, sometimes I'll go back to something I wrote a long time ago and I'm like, oh yeah, this is good. I did something that's not terrible. And like, if I'd looked at it at the time, I probably would have hated it. But, having that separation, having that distance when you've sort of forgotten it, I think it makes you realise that we're obviously our own worst judges. But once you've got the distance from it, you can sort of see it perhaps a little bit more objectively.
Yeah. Someone said to me, actually, the person that said this to me was the comics laureate, Bobby Joseph, who I was just talking to yesterday, because he's going to come on the podcast. But he was saying that you write the story because something in the story has resonated with you. And so it's not really about whether or not you think it's perfect or not. It's out there in the world and it might resonate with someone else. And that's what it's about, which I think was quite a good way of looking at it. You started it for a reason. That idea came into your head for a reason. Because it was something it spoke to you, whether it's like, it doesn't have to be some like really deep message, just, it could be a joke that you thought was funny or like a story that you thought was cool and worth exploring. And if you thought it would, then somebody else will. It doesn't have to be millions of people, but somebody else will.
Yeah, right, for an audience of one, I think.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
In my case, that's my editor, but just imagine something.
The difference is yours will be read by more than one person, whereas probably just that one person. So what's next? What have you got planned coming up? What future? You've got the launch at the start of June of the publication of Toby and the Pixies. What's next on the horizon for you?
I've recently finished writing on a non-fiction graphic novel about the human digestive system. So I think that's also
delightful.
Coming up this year. That's something to look out for, called Pooh Crew Adventures.
I love it. Right, great.
Which I took on mostly because it sounded like a funny thing to do, but it is actually a real book. I'm also working on. I have been working on a while on a new pitch for the Phoenix, which it's quite early to be talking about it, and it may never come to be. But its sort of working title is Dungeon School, about a sort of a school for adventurers learning how to do dungeons. It sounds quite rote, but the idea is that I'm going to sort of upturn a lot of the sort of fantasy tropes and just sort of make a fun story about kids at school. It's just that the school happens to have a dragon in the basement and the teacher's a wizard, sort of thing. It's
sounds good.
A progression of what I did with I Hate Pixies, I think, in terms of more characters and more storytelling while still being fantastical and fun.
Sounds brilliant. And what's the kind of time pipeline of that? How long is it from having these kind of early discussions and pitching ideas to something appearing in a publication like the Phoenix? Is it quite a long lead time?
I mean, it's probably not as long for most things. I think I probably first told them about this last year sometime and have not made much progress. I keep saying I'm going to have something to show them and keep not doing that, but hopefully at least some scripts this year, perhaps in the comic next year. That's I'm setting myself that as an Odyssean contract. So
when you've got something that's like serialized in the Phoenix, is the whole kind of sequence, is that all complete before it ever goes in? You're not like cycling things over on your bike to get into the next week's Phoenix? It's quite often fairly close to the wire.
I think they've definitely changed things, and they do have more of a backlog than they used to. So it used to be, I'd finish a Starcat and then it would be in it next week, and I'd be like, gosh, that was close. But now they do tend to run things a lot
Things have evolved
a lot further in advance. But that does remind me I need to get some clatters and bumps done.
Do you do those in a chunk? How does that work? Are you doing them in sort of sitting and working out 10 at a time, or as they come to you?
It tends to be that I'll write them in a block, so you sort of get into that mode of thinking. So it's easier to sort of write quite a few in a go. Then it takes me a while to draw them again because of that self-criticality. It's like, it's hard to sit down and draw something and like, oh no, this is another reason it's good to have another artist do it, because then they can't be sitting there thinking the script is rubbish. Why am I drawing this? Well, I can, but I don't have to see them do that. There's that constant doubt when you're drawing your own thing, and that sort of slows down my drawing, unfortunately, a lot. But so I'm sort of then, having sat down and written all these scripts in one go, I do sort of one a week, really, which is ridiculous because they probably take less than an hour to draw if I did it all in one go. But yeah, it's also, I do that outside of my normal hours, so it's like I'm just having to find times to do it as well.
I think they're brilliant. They're my favourite one. They're my favourite one in a favourite little strip.
They're my favourite too.
So we're coming to the end of the podcast now, and at the end I always like to ask guests to have maybe some thoughts that might help educators, something practical that they can put into action. And I've seen you before, when I was sort of researching this episode, I've seen you talk a little bit about ways to support. Well, it wasn't framed as this in this way. You're talking about sort of how you generate ideas for your stories and things like that. And I just thought that might be really useful for teachers to hear, because often it's something, the blank page is something that everyone struggles with, and children are people, so they struggle with it too. Do you have any tips as to how we can encourage children that might be struggling to think of something to write about, to kind of help them on their way to finding a hook of something they could explore as a story?
I think perhaps the thing to think about is how many Clatters and Bump comics, for instance, never get past the first panel. I'll draw that first panel. I'll write out loads of ideas and then throw away most of them and just stick with the good ones. And I feel like that's not something that I encountered at school. It was always, you just go from beginning to end writing whatever.
You haven't got time. You've just got to get on with one idea. Yeah.
You're sitting there in class or even at homework. You're not like taking something and throwing it away. But instead you're just not even starting. So perhaps that would be my advice, would just be, write 100 bad ideas and then have a look, and they'll be like, oh, actually quite a few of these were good. So that's my process, is just, writing down a lot of silly things. It's usually, in the case of Clatters and Bump, Clatters walks in and asks Bump what he's doing, and Bump is hitting something with a hammer, or he's, glued himself to a wall, or, it doesn't matter. You write that first idea without having any idea of where it's going to end. And then you're just like, because you've thought about the characters, perhaps this is another tip, is having these well-defined characters that you know how they behave. But yeah, because of that first setup, then you're like, oh, well, I know what Bump would do here, or I know what Clatters would do here. And then like, well, because he said that, I know what the other character would do. And then you've got 3 panels of your 4-panel comic. And then you're like, well, because of all this, I can think of something funny. Because, that's just makes sense. And that doesn't always happen every time. You might only get to the 2nd panel. You might only get to the 3rd panel. And there's no punchline. But just giving yourself the freedom to come up with loads of ideas and then seeing where they go is that's very much my method, if you can call it that. So I think perhaps if there's a way, I don't know how you do it, but if there's a way to give kids the freedom to try that, I think that might really help.
I think having that access, I know that some schools have more of a writing for pleasure kind of approach, where children have writing journals. So it's not just in their English lesson that they're writing down their ideas or having to start their ideas, so they could, maybe be writing down ideas for characters that may or may not go somewhere. But then when they start their writing, they've got a whole bank of ideas that they can draw on already, that kind of journaling.
I've got a file in my drive just called ideas, lots of just bits of ideas that just come to me. and I quickly write them down and almost never go back to them. But sometimes they'll be like, go back and be like, oh wait, that's a good thing. I can fish that out and tie that into this other thing I'm doing. And it's good to have that bank of bits that can get tied in, make a little patchwork.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I forgot to ask you about, this is where the ratings of the podcast will drop off. The advent calendar thing on Twitter. I am obsessed. Literally, highlight of my year. Can we just have a brief chat about that? How did you start doing this silly game with the advent calendars? And do you really take it as seriously as you purport to on your Twitter feed? But it just made me laugh a lot.
Yes, okay, yes, the calendar thing. Yes, it's
so silly.
It started at work, I think. We would just have an advent calendar at work. And if you open an advent calendar door, it's like, oh, it's a candle, great. It's a picture of a snowman. Where's the fun in that? So I was like, well, what if I try and guess it? What if I try and guess what's going to be behind it? Because I figured like there's only a sort of a fairly small pool of images you can get behind an advent calendar door. It should be guessable, really. And I think there's also an element of when I'm doing it, even when I was doing it at work, there's a character there. There's a character that believes that there's a narrative to the calendar that you can't.
That there's some sort of logic behind it.
You can't put Santa Claus behind door one because he's like the main character. He's the hero. He should be late in the calendar. And so I let the advent calendar guesser take me over, and you get into this frame where it does become important to try and guess these things, and you believe that you can get it, and it can even be that I'm staring at that calendar thinking, I can get this. What is it? And I'm actually genuinely in that moment like frozen with indecision, like, should I guess candle or should I guess wreath? And if I open the door and it's something I think I could have guessed or even should have guessed, I'm furious with myself. So it is like I'm like approaching it as a joke, but once I'm in that zone, once December is upon us,
it's real.
It's real, and I really.
Is there much deliberation around which calendar you're going to choose?
I no longer choose the calendar. My wife now acts as an independent adjudicator, and she selects the calendars, and they're quite surprising what the things that she comes up with, and it's good to come to it fresh, not knowing what I'm expecting, not being able to do that analysis in advance. So I appreciate having that independence overseeing me.
And have you really got a spreadsheet about what was behind all the different doors?
I really do have that spreadsheet. My wife was the one who maintained it because I was not that organised, but having that spreadsheet has been a valuable tool. And knowing exactly how many times a candle comes up really gives me some idea of how safe
this is the maths background. The maths background is coming in, the statistical analysis.
Exactly. I need to do a curve of how many. How often
I knew that degree would come in useful. It's brilliant. I love it. People who don't follow you on Twitter should follow you. I'm refusing to call it X. I'm not. Oh yeah. That's not.
You're not a monster.
No.
I understand.
No. So yeah, on people who don't follow you on Twitter should definitely do that, and we'll be able to find you in the show notes. It's not the most seasonal of conversations. I feel like it's a shame there's not more advent calendar type moments throughout the year. We should have calendars for more events counting down.
We had a birthday calendar once.
That would be good.
That's February though. Yeah, growing up, I think they've maybe an Easter calendar.
What, with doors on it?
Yeah, with doors on it.
A birthday calendar with doors on it?
Yeah, I think it was only 14, but
I think I missed out.
Gap in the market. Someone thought they could get in there.
It has been brilliant talking to you. There's one more question that we always end the podcast on. If we were to add one book to our to be read piles, it could be a comic, a book about comics, what would you recommend we read?
Oh gosh. Hang on, let me take a look at my bookshelf.
Everyone does that. To be fair to you, you haven't seen these questions in advance.
Yeah,
I sometimes do have to pull people up when they've had it for weeks and they haven't thought about this. Something that would be of interest to the teachers and librarians listening, but it could be for their own reading for pleasure. It doesn't have to be for the children they work with. Something you love.
Perhaps I'd say something by Ursula Le Guin, if we're going for something. I mean, the Earthsea Chronicles is something that kids would enjoy, I think. And but I think that The Right Hand of Darkness was something that really, on the subject of science fiction, it's something that really, twists your head trying to understand the ideas in it and seeing things from a totally different perspective. I don't know if that's appropriate for something about comics, but it's a science fiction book that is a very good example of casting a mirror up to society.
No, I think that sounds brilliant and links in with the sort of things we've been discussing. So thank you for that. That is an excellent recommendation. I will put a link in the show notes to that so that people can find it if they're interested. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. It's been brilliant to chat to you. Yeah, it's great to have you as a guest.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
There you have it. Thanks so much to James for joining me on today's episode. I love talking to him. Absolutely can't wait for Toby and the Pixies to come out so that a wider audience can access those excellent stories and just enjoy James's sense of humour that comes out from the page. You don't have to wait long. It is coming out next week. That book is going to be released on the 6th of June. So get your pre-orders in and you might be able to get it on the day if you're quick enough to listen to the episode. Thanks to David Fickling for helping me to arrange that conversation. And I'd just like to say again, thanks to our brilliant sponsors, ALCS, a not-for-profit organisation supporting over 120,000 members to collect money for all of the secondary uses of their work. So really an organisation that supports authors and makes sure that they're properly reimbursed for all of the uses of their work from beyond the sales. So things like uses in education, academia, and so on. I know many of my author friends are very grateful to receive a little bumper payment from ALCS once a year. Just going to highlight some of their resources that are available on the ALCS website at the end of each episode. So I know we're coming up in a couple of weeks at the end of June to the Carnegie Awards, and there are some nice lightweight quizzes and interactive activities all themed around children's literature and copyright rules and things like that. Those are available for download on the copyright education section of the ALCS's website. I'll put a link in the show notes. My recommendation this week is going to be a brilliant series of comics that I've just stumbled upon. They're published by Flying Eye. They're book form, but not long, not like a graphic novel length, kind of a picture book length comic called Fantasy Sports by Sam Bosma. And I just really, really enjoyed these comics. There's 1, 2, and 3. Each comic has a different sport, but it's kind of a mix of fantasy, almost Indiana Jones type adventuring, but with a bit of magic in there, and then a sporting element as well. So it just ticked so many boxes for me. On the back cover of the first Fantasy Sports story, there is a quote which says it's the offspring of Spirited Away and Space Jam. And I was in. From that moment on, I was like, yes, please, that absolutely sounds like something I want to read. I really enjoyed it. I love the artwork. I love the action sequences, the way that the panel structure reflects the kind of fast-paced sports activity that's going on. There's some really nice humour in there, some visual gags as well, which just made me laugh out loud. It was just delightful. I really love it. I love the way that the storyline between the two main characters, Wiz and Mug, kind of there's flashbacks, you hear their origin story as you go through the series, and it builds up layer on layer. Just great fun, really accessible, and really enjoyed them. So I'm glad that I stumbled across them. I thought they were brilliant. Highly recommended from me, right up my street. That's it for Comic Boom this week. Thank you so much for listening. The reception to this series has been brilliant. I've loved seeing everyone sharing on social media and the real buzz about last week's episode. So thank you for that. Just a reminder, we are fortnightly now, not weekly. It gives me a little bit more breathing room and a little bit longer to listen to it as well for you guys. But please, if you would like to support the podcast, sharing on social media is the number one way that you can do that. Help us get that message out there. Let other people who might be interested know that we're here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've read some of the titles that have been recommended by guests or featured in the podcast, would love to hear some of your thoughts. So please get in touch. You can do that on Instagram by @comic_boom_podcast, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter /X @Lucy_Braidley. So please do all of those things. You can find the details in the show notes. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast and the titles that we've covered, the topics that we've covered. So much to think about with the Nick Susanis episode last week. And then that's really seeping into the questions that I'm wanting to ask the creators that I meet about their work and their approaches. So plenty more to come. We've got some brilliant episodes coming up. The next one in 2 weeks' time is again something a bit different, a community-based project working with children, particularly care experienced children with a social worker in a school setting, all based around comics. Some really, really fantastic, powerful work going on there. So keep your eyes open for the next episode. My name is Lucy Starbuck Braidley. I'm the host and producer of Comic Boom. Thanks for listening.